The Diolkos has long been considered a sort of ancient transportation system that was used to move goods and ships from a port on the one side of the Isthmus of Corinth to the other. But was that really the case? First up, the basics. As you can see here on this map, we've got the Isthmus of Corinth, and you can see in the larger map in the bottom right hand corner why this might be considered a good thing, because after all, you've got that large Peloponnese area, but you could not go around the entire Peloponnese. Instead, you could go across the Isthmus of Corinth, which is actually quite narrow as 6 kilometers in some parts. Now, Nero had an initial idea of creating a canal there, but a canal wasn't actually finished until the end of the 19th century. Here's a satellite map, and you can actually see where the modern-day Corinthian canal is, and that actually follows a similar track to the Diolkos, but slightly different. Now, you can imagine why this might be such a good thing. I mean, if, for example, you were Corinth and you owned and controlled this region, it would make you incredibly powerful from a commercial perspective. And in a way, it makes a lot of commercial sense. I mean, you're Corinth, you control this region, and you're a city-state, remember? City-states are incredibly territorial and very competitive with each other. So if Corinth could find a way to move ships and goods from one gulf to another, that gave them a huge commercial advantage. And so the Diolkos was born, not a canal, as I've mentioned, but as a trackway, or rather, that's the argument. And this was apparently created under the rule of Periander, who was a tyrant at Corinth between the 7th and 6th centuries BC. However, this is where we start to find some issues, because the sources aren't exactly aligned to what all of this meant. For example, take the word Diolkos. That's not actually used until Strabo, who was writing in the 1st century BC. So several centuries after this was apparently used. And then when you look at the sources of the time, that is to say the ancient Greek sources, they don't really say anything at all about this being used in a commercial context. That is to say, ships being hauled across the isthmus purely as a way of them being more efficient, of moving goods more easily. It's only mentioned really when it comes to military ships being used. And even then, it's sort of as a novelty, something that you could be really proud of achieving. So, in a way, something against the norm. In fact, Marcus Antonius, the grandfather of Mark Antony, was so proud of his achievement in doing that, he actually had it set in a poem. But that said, there are the trackways, and there are even cut channels. These are grooves which are seen as trackways, i.e. what you had was you had wagons that could move along these fixed trackways and transport stuff. But what exactly were they transporting? Well, let's consider ships for a start. So the idea that they were moving merchant ships. Well, there's nothing in the evidence that we've got from our sources that suggests this took place. There's also the logistics of it. Now, logistically, this would have been incredibly difficult to do because even back then, the sort of medium-sized cargo ships were moving a lot of goods. And to then unpack them, move them across, and then move the ship is really, really difficult thing. For example, to move 25 tons of olive oil, which wasn't actually a great amount by those at that point, you'd need 50 pairs of oxen. 50 pairs of oxen are a lot of oxen. They don't move that quickly and they require a lot of foodstuffs. And then you've got to think about moving the ship itself. Ships aren't great out of water. And so what happens if one gets damaged? Also, what happens if one gets damaged on the way? I mean, that's going to create a huge jam. But it was obviously being used for something. And this is a photo, as you can see, by Walter Werner, who was one of the archaeologists who helped excavate it. And as you can see on here, you can actually even see the trackways. But much of the Diolkos is perhaps not what we think it to be. And that's actually ironic given the name of it. So that's Strabo again who named it the Diolkos, but he probably wasn't referring to the trackway. He was more likely referring to a region or a small narrow part of the isthmus, the sort of 6 kilometre narrow part, as the Diolkos, not necessarily the trackway. But anyway, that aside, what it was probably being used for was a highway, as it were, upon which you could move goods, but perhaps not in the way we think. So perhaps not these large ships and all of those goods, but perhaps smaller goods. You could still move between those two ports. Alternatively, you could move your goods to this trackway and then it could go to either of those ports I've just mentioned on either side of the isthmus. And one candidate for this has been the movement of stone. So cut stone blocks or stone blocks of around 6 or 7 tons. Brilliant. This would be fantastic to facilitate movement of them to one of the particular ports. So that's a probability. But even if it didn't do the grand thing we think it did, it was still very useful to have and would have been highly beneficial to serve all of those commercial interests. So it's a bit of a curiosity, but an absolutely fascinating one.